Okay. Grab that. Yeah. 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 I'm sorry, guys.
Check, check. Check, check. Check, check.
Ready? Let's do this. Good? Can you get my question? Did Megan? I will do my best. All right. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to McNally Jackson. We are so happy to have you here. We have a very special treat tonight. Our guests are, of course, Richard Pevear and Larissa Bolokonsky, who are, at least for our generation, pretty much the most prolific, decorated, award-winning, and beloved translators of Russian classic literature. At the request of Sarah McNally, I will be moderating tonight. I'm completely unqualified to do so, but I have read most of their books, and so I hope that this will be interesting. In the meantime, please turn off your cell phones. We will be able to take some questions from the audience, and you will be able to get your book signed at the end. So, making a very rare appearance at an American bookstore, please make our guests feel very welcome.
Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for having invited us.
I know it's kind of yeah, we just have to. So anyway, we are here tonight to celebrate your new translation of Pushkin, which we're going to get to in a minute. But before we do, I just wanted to ask some general questions about the two of you and your process and the concept of translation in general. Mr. Pevear, do you remember what was the first kind of classic Russian novel as a reader that moved you?
I think it was, can you hear me? I think it was Dr. Zhivago, which came out just as I was growing up. It came out in 1958. I was 18 or something, no, 17. So, but I read this book and it moved me very much. And then when I was a sophomore, I took a summer and went to took a summer school course in Russian literature at Harvard Summer School, which you could get into just by applying. You didn't have to be a Harvard student. And I had an absolutely wonderful professor, Vladimir Mark, who was, at that time was in Berkeley. He had a very interesting, very varied life. He had been a poet and then emigrated and got a job picking grapes in California, and I finally hired him in Berkeley. But was a marvelous teacher. So that was my first really saturation doing Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov.
And for you, Ms. Volokonsky, I know you grew up in Russia, correct?
Yes, I was born in Russia and lived there for quite a while. And Russians read. When I was young, which was long ago, we didn't have much else to do. The television was very limited and boring. There was very little outside entertainment. So we sort of sat up and read
And taught
and talked.
about what you read.
But in America, you know, in terms of like the great American classics when we're going to school, you know, and there's this kind of eat your vegetables, it's good for you kind of quality to it, you know, it's like Sinclair Lewis, and you know, it's like, and then you kind of hit on one that really rings for you, meaning that obviously being from Russia, you know, Russian novels wouldn't have the kind of mystique that they do, say, for us. So my question is, do you remember like your first great love affair with a Russian novel, the first one that really blew your mind?
I was 13 when I read War and Peace. Only I skipped the war. I was interested in all these little family stories and domestic love affairs. In the beginning, that is very interesting. It's not that all these young people are in love, but they are in love with being in love, and it's childish love. I liked it very much. Later on,
Were you the same?
do you want to know it at this point?
We should go ahead and clarify for those of you who don't know. Mr. Pevira and Ms. Volokonsky are married.
To each other.
To each other. Act 2.
Later on, I discovered that war was also interesting, very, very interesting.
But I remember reading that book myself, and it's, you know, it's kind of peace, war, and the war sections are very detailed. Wasn't my favorite part, but it does. It kind of ends up having this rhythm, you know, to it as well. I remember the first time I read Proust, you know, the farther I got into it, the more I was captivated by, you know, the plot. I needed to know what was going to happen, and so, you know, when he would go off on, you know, the chairs, you know, in, you know, Madame Delacroix's, you know, drawing room, it was frustrating for me. And the same way with Tolstoy, like I wanted to get back to, you know, Boris and Natasha and, you know, the Rostovs and everyone, but the war parts are equally good, and of course as you get older. You were able to speak English from a very early age, or read in English, correct?
Yes, it is correct.
Do you remember the first book you read in English? Or did you have a love affair with an English novel?
What did I read? I read the Dubliners by George. Yeah, it's one of my first books.
It's pretty spectacular.
I
You didn't
also
start
read-
with Lewis Carroll.
No. Yes, we all read. You know what we read? This author is unknown, I think now in the Anglophone world. Jerome K. Jerome, it's a British author who wrote comic stories and comic novellas. The most famous one was Three Men in a Boat to Say Nothing About a Dog. For some reason it became
That's the subtitle.
tremendously popular in Russia, and we all read it when we
You read
studied.
also May Reed.
We read it in translation and very heavily edited because he was a
But
racist.
has anyone here ever heard of May Reed? Thomas May Reed? Only Russian, probably. He was an Englishman who became an American.
Mark Twain, we read Mark Twain
Yeah.
a lot.
You credit often an older brother, I believe, with being kind of, if not force-feeding you, then certainly encouraging you to read very deeply. Is that accurate?
He wasn't encouraging me at all. He did it himself, and I just looked at him.
Right. That's great. Mr. Pivi, your background, your early story, which includes living in Maine and working on boats, and then being a cabinet maker. I mean, even though obviously you are a poet as well, and those other endeavors are creative, your resume reads more like a Jack Kerouac character than someone who would become, kind of the toast of academia and translation. And my question is, was this a life goal? Were you caught completely by surprise?
That kind of thing is very hard to answer because as you're doing it, it looks like it's a surprise. But then you look back at it and it turns out to be, it looks like it was a life goal. As if you were inevitably going to do that, but you didn't know it. So it was both.
Well, like something Tolstoy would say, which is apropos.
Maybe I'm quoting. No, but I don't know. No, it's, no, I started translating as just the same time that I started writing. I was writing poetry and I got interested in translating poetry, mainly French poetry and Spanish. But I just wanted to see how it would go and try to match in English what they were doing. People like Antonio Machado, Apollinaire was the first. La Jolie Ruse.
So just a technical.
This is La Jolie Ruse.
Just a technical question. Are you a Russian translator or an English translator? Do you refer to the language you're translating from or the language you're translating into?
The language I translate into.
So you'd be an English translator?
Yeah, into English.
Got it. All right, that makes sense. So you actually, you were quite fluent already in Spanish and French, as you just mentioned. Russian was later.
Russian is still later.
Yeah, there is kind of like a folk tale that, and we'll get to this in a minute, but that you are the English half of the team, and that Ms. Volokhonsky is the Russian half of the team. But you're actually better at Russian than people would assume, right?
Well, I became better. Yeah. I started knowing very little, really, but I learned a great deal as we worked. We've done 30 books, lived 33 years together, and our children were brought up bilingual, so in order to figure out what they were plotting against, I had to know Russian. So I learned a lot of Russian, but and just doing the translating, I learned a lot. Certainly, I couldn't work without others.
But what you're speaking about the French and the Spanish, was that before you all started working together, or has that been since?
No, it was long before, when I was 17.
And Ms. Volokhonsky, have you ever done any translation work before the two of you worked together?
I tried my hand at translating. I failed miserably. Because I grew up in a literary milieu. All my friends were either those who weren't painters were writers and translators. So I tried to, I discovered I had no gift for any of it. And it was only this work together that revealed some sort of ability in me.
Obviously so. So you make a really sweet comment, kind of talking about your love story, which is that primarily it took a long time. You all met in New York, is that correct? But someone was trying to set you up previously. Is that correct?
Well, we met in Connecticut, the University of Connecticut. In my opinion, by accident. But I discovered later it was
There are
somewhat.
no accidents. There is a French proverb which freely translated would go like that. Accident with God is promenading incognito.
That's good. What other languages do you speak or read?
I speak and read French and English. That is all.
Ancient Greek.
No, I have
You don't speak
I
ancient.
have working knowledge of some of the languages and ancient languages, but I cannot say I really know them.
So you meet in New York, and can you just retell the story, your first project together was, I believe, was it Karamazov?
Yeah.
And you were reading a translation of it, and I believe that at least the popular folk version of the story is that you looked over at his
I
shoulder
didn't
and
know there was a popular folk.
found
My God.
No, it just, I was reading the book and Larissa,
You mean Wikipedia is a popular folk genre?
no, but I was reading the novel in English, in Magarshak's translation. I had already read it at Harvard in Garnett's translation. I was decided to try a new translation. So that time there were only two, I think.
but it was
So I was reading it, and Larissa decided to reread it in Russian. And then she got curious. How did they translate this phrase? And she looked at my English and she said, I see they didn't translate it. And this kept happening and kept happening. And we discovered that really a whole dimension of Dostoevsky's art had been omitted.
It's
By
not,
the translator.
it wasn't omitted, it was sort of flattened out, the joke, the verbal humor,
didn't
or
understand it.
verbal,
And he was
anything.
playing with words, the way Joyce plays with words. They didn't know that this whole what do you call it, level of writing existed in his work. They thought he was obsessed himself, depressed, obsessed, and dark, cold, and tormented. And all the stylistic humor was simply sort of eliminated because they thought it shouldn't be there. It was a mistake.
Yeah,
So we
humor,
decided to translate it with the style and the stylistic humor.
and playfulness, not necessarily even humor. Whenever he did Dostoevsky did anything interesting with language, it sort of disappeared in translation.
They weren't sure. They thought it shouldn't be there, so they made sure it wasn't there. But this was a major thing. In most cases, you don't find that much of a loss in translation. In this case, a very large part of Dostoevsky is totally misunderstood.
So this entire enterprise really was kind of launched on your total dissatisfaction with how Dostoevsky was being read in English, correct?
That's a way of putting it.
But so it was almost like a public service, right?
You say total dissatisfaction. I wouldn't put it this way. Garnett's translations are good. She's a very good translator. Just that there's things, stylistic things that are missing in her translation, which we thought were important.
I wanted to actually ask about that because Garnett is very often referred to as, she's very good at, I believe she's people like her Gogol, right, and people like her Chekhov, and not as much her Dostoevsky, am I incorrect? But that certain translators seem to be, people will say they're really good with, this one and less so with someone else. I think
I haven't read her Gogol. I doubt that she did it well. It's not her kind of writing.
I read, my first War and Peace I read was translated by a woman named Rosemary Edmonds, who I never
Right,
see mentioned. But I think she did it for Penguin.
Yeah, she did the Penguin.
But I've never come across anyone who ever said, well, I finally read War and Peace and I don't know what the big deal is. It almost seems like to a certain extent that, translations, my question is that do you think you could, I guess it's possible, but, to a certain extent it seems that the power of these classics seems to get through to people initially, regardless of the translator, but we're talking about, levels, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it depends on the writer, but I think Tolstoy more or less comes across in the translation.
So does Chekhov,
So does Chekhov.
undoubtedly.
Who doesn't? Who's tough?
Well, Gogol is very hard. And I could do 5 pages of Dostoevsky in one day, I mean 5 typed pages. I could do maybe 7 of Tolstoy. I will do 2 of Gogol.
Wow.
And it's not that I just labored and rewrote, but just getting the words for the first time onto the paper took me that long.
Pasternak is completely lost in the first translation.
Really?
Stylistically, it's just not Pasternak at all. The story is there, the language is, and the translators knew it. They had to work very quickly because they decided to give him the Nobel Prize, and the publishers wanted translation done very, very quickly, and they had no time to work on it at all.
Really? Wow. Do you mind describing just kind of your process? Because I think it's fascinating, and I'm sure some people aren't aware of that. But if you're going to translate, as with, say the Pushkin, like what is the kind of process? How do you start?
I start by taking a blank page and a very well sharpened pencil, and I give the Russian text, and I start writing on this empty page. The translation that some people call literal, and I always say that literal translations do not exist unless you translate a phone book. And I try to be very close to the Russian text. I try to reproduce the syntax, commenting on it, like whether it's a normal syntax or something odd, something interesting, like parallel constructions or some mixed metaphor or some slangy word that's not stole but filched, for instance.
And sometimes, like Dostoevsky messes up a metaphor, but he does it always on purpose. He sort of starts in one kind of metaphor and then ends in another one. It's very funny.
These would be these incredible.
That's what I do, and I give this mess to Mr. Ferrier.
With comments in the mark.
Yes, and he works with it and produces his version, which I then read, and against the original we discuss it. We raise questions, we go back and forth. We go back and forth about 5 times. And we live with the text,
Then we read publishers' proofs 3 times.
Yes, we read it aloud. Richard reads it aloud, the almost final version, and I follow the Russian text. It's very important to hear how it sounds, how it goes, rhythmically, how it sounds.
There's that wonderful interview that was done a few years ago with you guys in the New York Review of Books, where you said at that point, I believe, and if I'm misquoting you, please correct me again, but that you try not to over-editorialize, that you try to give Mr. Ferrier as many options as possible, but as you're talking about, say, like a broken metaphor in Dostoevsky, that's going to be something that you would have to be in the culture or of the culture to kind of know, right? I mean, that's not something that someone who kind of learns Russian as a second language would be aware of.
Yes, I try to give all kinds of possibility to keep it open. Like there are words that can be translated as proud, arrogant, haughty, down the nose, or even contemptuous, or whatever. The thesaurus gives many more possibilities. Or there are lots of words for being drunk in Russian and in English.
Many more in Russian.
No, I wouldn't agree with that. No, English is very rich with these, and it's
Irish is better. Irish English.
It's hard. Sometimes we have to think very hard to decide precisely which one is right for this context.
But obviously, as you're talking about in terms of being able to do, say, 5 pages of this author or 7 pages of another author, there would have to be some sort of relationship between your own natural kind of sensibilities and writing style and those of these other writers, that some would come more easily and some would come more difficult. My question is, has there ever been, it would be remarkable if you both, kind of being different people yourselves, always felt the same way. Have there been authors that were more natural for you and more difficult for you, or vice versa?
I don't think so.
No?
I don't think so either. It's a professional thing. You have to get into it. Each time it takes a while. But each time we start translating a new book or even more so a new author, it takes a while to get into it. We work very, very slowly in the beginning. But then you start hearing, it starts sort of working in your head, getting right in your head. At least it seems so to me.
But there's a quote where you said you don't consider yourself the writer, that you consider your job more. And I was wondering if you softened on that a bit. Have you thought about, would you ever do, because you translate, I believe, the Count of Monte Cristo, while she was generating the first draft of War and Peace, which took a minute.
I like to generate these, as you put it nicely, these versions. And I have no writing gift.
All right.
And we're translating into English, so that's always the final question. What does it do in English? Does it work in English?
Well, I had a really stupid question, which was that, as a translator, what would be the better skill? Would you, to be, say, translating Tolstoy, would it be more beneficial to be proficient in Russian or proficient in English? Since, you would obviously probably have a greater proficiency in your national language. But of course, kind of the brilliance of having the two of you working as a team is that you have a native Russian speaker and a native English speaker, so you have proficiency in both. And obviously you guys have found this kind of dialogue in the middle.
Right. Yeah. I always have the last say, I think. As far as what finally goes into English, it has to feel right to me. But there's
You guys never argue at all.
we almost never
Smooth
argue.
sailing.
We never
We discuss it. We don't argue.
There's I did a lot of reading, about you guys and your career getting ready for this. And one of the things you notice is that translations engender a level of, I'll say passion, but really vitriol, that is unusual. And it's from, usually from critics. I'm sure that, I'm sure there's comments on Amazon too, but, we've all learned not to read those. But there seems to be, for some reason, this incredibly impassioned, almost anger at the blasphemy that someone else would be retranslating a book. And I can understand, when I read War and Peace, I didn't think about it that I was reading a translation. I was reading War and Peace. This felt to me to be the book. And you tell a story about Proust, right? You read Proust in a very specific translation, and then when the second translation came out, that it was provocative for you, yes?
Yes. The thing is that usually the first translation you read sort of stays with you. And if you read something and liked it, you think this is what I like. This is the author. This author exists for you in this translation. In this sense, I'm very astonished that some people like our translations. Among those who reread ours. On the other hand, it's a new translation creates a new vision of the author, and it is always very interesting. Like as you said, this second translation of Proust that I read in Russian was very, very different in tone and in style and in lexically. It was very, very different from the one I read first. And I started thinking, my God, why does he do that? I know that this is a good translator with good reputation. And I started looking, so that something must be there in the original that caused it. Yes, and then by then I knew French well enough, and I started looking up the French one, and I could see that there were reasons why he did it, and that was legitimate. And I think that all translations, they strive towards some kind of ideal, and they all approach this ideal more or less. And in this sense, all translations can be interesting to read. And there is no such thing as definitive translation.
You said that before. Can you just explain that? Like, why? Is it just because it's impossible because the languages are different, or? Should we just let that one go? Because
No,
I mean,
right. No, it's that each, well, there's a space of time between translations. I think the last translation of War and Peace before ours was done in like 30 years before.
Wow.
And so there are things that change, and this bothers a lot of people. They want a definitive thing. This is the real Tolstoy. I want that. Don't give me some other. But in fact, Russian readers also read Tolstoy differently depending on when they live. And so there's always a sense of dialogue. I think this one of the most important things about translation is it's not a replacement of one language with another. It's a dialogue with another language. And a good translator should allow this dialogue to go both ways. Sometimes we're accused of being too Russian, as if we're too literal or something like that. But sometimes I like some way that Tolstoy deformed Russian in a slight way, and I let the English get deformed in the same way, which, as long as it's if it works stylistically, it's good. You should be able to expand the language through translation, not apply some kind of editorial standard to all of it, so that it gets reduced in some way. The translation should enlarge language. It always did, way back when Chaucer was translating, in Shakespeare's time. The translations, like Marlowe's translation of it, enlarged English language for his time. And he added stylistic peculiarities that are sort of Latinisms, Latin stylistic qualities, which then became permanent part of English. After all, translation, except for the Greeks themselves, who refused to translate, just didn't translate. They were the first. But immediately the Romans began translating the Greeks. So translation made Roman language, Latin, into a literary language. So this is part of the whole history and the quality, the effect of translation on the language. So I think about that with English. Finally, what I bring from Russian into English should be an enlargement of English.
Because these writers initially were groundbreaking, in Russian, right? I mean, especially like Dostoevsky, like stylistically, he was doing Pushkin, which we're going to get to in just a second. These people, they were breaking new ground linguistically. So if they were doing that in their own language, there was a comment that the problem with a lot of earlier translations of Dostoevsky was that they kind of clean him up, and that there's a roughness, kind of a natural roughness to him that was obviously intentional, that you two seem to be intent on, if not preserving, then at least allowing people to have a better idea of what it would have been like to read him in Russia.
Yes, right.
It's a tricky question because how you do it. Like, for instance, Dostoevsky wrote, you say, broke new ground in a certain way, but he wrote in the language that hasn't changed much since. Like a Russian reader today can read Dostoevsky.
Yeah, it's not like reading the
It's
ancient
not
form
that
of
we
English.
are updating him, trying. We try not to use the words that appeared after his time or later than the end of the 19th century. So it's not like good news for modern man, you know,
That's the Bible.
we're not doing that. But obviously we impose our sensibility, literary sensibility, on the way we read him. For instance, especially with Dostoevsky, at the turn of the century, was considered a bad writer. A lot of people thought he was a thinker and a
Interesting
religious thinker and philosopher, and it was all very interesting, but he wrote badly. Now, this perception changed during the 20th century because there is a research, people study his drafts. It was discovered that this roughness, this strangeness sometimes, this spoken style, because Dostoevsky's, even his narrator also writes in kind of spoken style.
Narrators are characters.
Is a stylistic device that he did it deliberately. So previous translators thought he wrote badly, had to be corrected. Now we think he wrote very brilliantly. It's very interesting what he did with language, and we try to convey it in English.
I got you. So, because you made a comment that Tolstoy's narrator is always Tolstoy, but that Dostoevsky would use different characters even within the same book.
Yeah.
Which is like Faulkner, I'm guessing, like As I Lay Dying, where each chapter is narrated by a different character. Or Sound of the
Sound of the Flute.
Yeah. I don't think that was incredibly apparent to me when I read Dostoevsky the first time.
Yeah, you have to think about it because it's. He makes it very clear. The narrator of the Brothers Karamazov lives in the same village that all the Karamazovs lived in. He talks about them sort of intimately and knew them, and he's not always right. He even gets things wrong. That's the beauty of Dostoevsky. Nobody has the final word.
But Tolstoy, for instance,
Tolstoy always has the final word.
No, he has the final word, but he is very interesting because Tolstoy has this gift of becoming someone else. You know, there are scenes which are described through the eyes of a 6-year-old girl.
No.
There are scenes that are described through the eyes of a dog.
Yes.
Tolstoy becomes a dog or a horse. You know, right? Yes.
Which is revolutionary. I mean, that's something that for English readers in 2016 to discover anew, even in a book that's 150 years old, that could spark it. You know, that's not something that people are doing in English. But when you're talking about kind of broadening the language into which you're translating, that would be a great example.
Yeah.
You know, see if Gillian Flynn wants to take that one on that. When I think about translating, like I said, you don't think about translation until you start to think about it. And I think, you know, I can understand translating Sherlock Holmes. I can understand translating, say Steinbeck. But then I think about Shakespeare. It's like, how in the hell would you translate Shakespeare? Because you've got so much going on at the same time. And you speak about this really beautifully with a lot of the great writers. But in Shakespeare, you've got the iambic pentameter, and then inside of that you have half of the words were coined by, you know, he was making the words up himself. But I think, is it Dostoevsky that does the same thing as well? Kind of coins his own.
Sometimes, yeah.
But that, and then you have all the biblical allusions and all the allusions to classical Greek, and then you have the kind of character-driven stuff, then you have the English history. And so if you think about that as a task, like how, then you start to kind of understand, like it's kind of a miracle that like translations ever really happen.
Well, it's, as you said, how in the hell? You know?
That I don't have to translate Shakespeare.
There are 5 translations of Hamlet into Russian. maybe more by now. I know about 5. I know there are 13 translations into Russian of the famous monologue. And they're all different. And they're all in that above mentioned pentameter. You lose a lot. You lose a lot. Like Pasternak's translation is brilliant. We read it. It entered the language. We used lines from it as sayings, just as we do in English. But it is, he departed from the original. He didn't convey all of the above. There is another translation by a very, very gifted translator who also translated the Divine Comedy, which is much closer to the original, but some people are dissatisfied with its poetic quality. You can do all of it. It's like we are arriving at Evgeny Onegin, I'm afraid.
We're about to land here, yes.
You just can't do it.
Right.
You can't keep all of it. You can't keep all this playfulness and allusions and indirect citations and the rhythm and the rhyme, and have the impression that Pushkin's original produces on a Russian reader, because
There was one review, I'm afraid it was in Amazon. I don't remember exactly where it was. Anyway, a Russian writer talked about one of our books and said, very, very bad. Bad, not a single word of the original is left. And I wrote a response, I said, exactly. There's not one word of Russian in it.
But
I can imagine how, for a Russian reader, that feels. You read this thing in English, and what's that got to do with War and Peace? There's not one word of the original.
of course. Were you surprised at when you started to started to make a name for yourself, and at some of the level of defensiveness and kind of aggressiveness that people would have? I mean, we're not in the era where people used to be burned at the stake for bad translations of the Old Testament, but I mean, even back to the days of the Maud sisters versus Constant Garnet, they had their defenders and their detractors. Nabokov was a bitch to translators. Had absolutely no patience for what he considered, basically anyone else's translation.
Except for his own.
But were you surprised at how angry people would get at word choices in Russian novels that were 200 years old? Were you surprised, or did you understand?
Well, there's always something a little more than a disagreement in words behind all that. There's some kind of anger or envy or something like that. I don't know what it is that fuels this. We have a few critics who hate us and denounce us.
You're laughing. You like that.
Critics, what
there's something there besides, because once you start doing that, if you take a translation, you can find everything is wrong. This is bad, that's bad, they shift this, they do that.
Nothing is easier than to criticize a translation. I myself can criticize our translation. I read it in the evening, then in the morning I think, why did we say that?
I was actually going to ask you that, and it's obviously a dumb question, but I was interested. We all get better at whatever we do as we age, and obviously log more hours, the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours thing. So my question is, when you now look back at some of the first things you translated, say, 30 years ago, 33 years ago at the beginning of this, do you ever kind of say, oh, I know how to do it now? Oh, I know what I would do there. Is there ever that kind of sense, or do you just try not to turn around?
I don't have that feeling at all, but maybe I just don't look back.
No, I do. I look back and I sometimes have questions in my mind which I address to Mr. Pevere. And he always said, no, that's right, we did it the right thing. That's how it goes.
And now we've arrived at Mr. Pushkin.
How did we get there? Okay.
One word at a time. Mr. Pushkin, it's amazing to me, and you wrote a beautiful introduction to it as well, but Pushkin's reputation amongst other great Russian writers is that he is kind of, even Tolstoy kind of, bowed down to Pushkin, which was kind of work with Tolstoy about anyway. But he seems to me lesser known, lesser read, less discussed, and I just find that interesting. And obviously there are like cultural things, but it's amazing to me that he is considered, if not the equal of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, then their master. And yet in this country, I think, he's down the list of Russian writers that people read. And my question is, do you have a theory? Why?
Are you talking about the English-speaking world?
Yes, why he is less known here, why he doesn't kind of have the same familiarity, at least, with English speaking.
One thing might be that he never deals with ideas, or with philosophy, with theology, with history, with meaning of things.
No psychology at all,
There's no
ever.
psychology.
And yeah,
And
right.
so it's very hard for people to write monographs about him. Because what do they say? All he did was write the most perfect works in Russian language.
But it's exquisite. I just finished it today, and The Captain's Daughter.
Ah, yes.
My God. And it
Captain's
is,
Daughter is an absolutely unbelievably great book.
but it's kind of like the
But it's a
citizen.
little thing, it's like nothing.
And the people in it are ordinary people, absolutely extraordinary work of fiction.
It's fantastic.
It is.
And it kind of like, but there's a, and I don't mean to say that it's light, but there's there's not this kind of like, when you're reading Tolstoy, you're reading Tolstoy, and there's a kind of a, it's a different sensation. It's kind of, it's a magic trick, it really is. Pushkin famously went off on Byron, who apparently he did admire, and because Byron was inserting himself into, it's like all of the characters in Byron are parts of Byron. This is like angry Byron, and this is like egomaniac Byron, and this is gay Byron, and this is like limping Byron. And Pushkin disagreed with that and is actually credited as having, like Shakespeare, what's it called? What's Keats's phrase?
Keats's phrase is negative capability.
Negative capability.
He could absorb everything. Because, Sinyavsky, who wrote a wonderful book about Pushkin, said he was nothing, and therefore he could take in everything. And he does it, but he does it with such balance and intelligence.
Harmony. This is the key word for Pushkin. There is harmony in him, and lightness of touch. There is light, radiance. I don't know what. We all weep. I weep when I read Pushkin, not from joy.
It's not from tear jerking. It's so good.
It's perfect. I don't know
Tears
why.
come to
It's very hard.
Yes,
to
but that's
know.
exactly what, it's not the words, it's not the plot, it's not the style, it's this kind of cumulative feeling that you get from reading it, and that's like, how do you translate that? Pushkin has kind of, there are fewer translations of Pushkin, certainly, than there would be of Tolstoy, and Nabokov, who was so mean to other translators, was teaching a course in Russian literature, and it's collected in his book of, his courses are actually printed. And he said that, he was so frustrated because he was constantly having to retranslate all of the passages for his students because he said, I can do nothing with Constant Garnett's dry shit, pardon my French. But then he devoted this enormous portion of his life, and Nabokov's,
10 years.
10 years, yeah. So only slightly less insecure than Tolstoy. But basically said, this is going to be my life's work, and this is going to be whatever. And I'm going to try this, I'm going to really screw it up. Eugene,
Onegin.
that.
Eugene Onegin.
Onegin.
Novel in verse.
Evgeny Onegin.
But it did not work. At least, and you said Of course, different
He
different
didn't want it
opinions.
to work in the way you mean.
What do you mean?
It didn't work poetically, he didn't try, he made it awful. And when he revised it, he said, I've made it worse.
But I mean, was it like Bob Dylan's self-portrait? Like he was just trying to.
No, what he was trying to do was give, he thought, first of all, he dismissed the idea of translating the poetry of Yevgeny Onegin, because he said, it can't be done. So all the efforts to do it a little bit into English, to follow a little bit the rhythms, the rhymes and all of that, you get some of it, but of course in order to rhyme you have to distort and change things all the time, because you need to rhyme, and so you say things that Pushkin never said. He dismissed all of that. He said, I will simply give the straight prose meaning of the Russian, with no poetry at all. And then he wrote a 2 fat volume commentary, which is absolutely brilliant. And if you read the 2 together, you get a very full sense of this poem, without, of course, having any of the music in your ear, because, as he said, you just can't have it. It's in Russian, after all.
Was Pushkin daunting? I mean, because he has been hard to translate apparently, and I mean, or he would have been translated
His
more.
poetry is daunting, very much so, because it's this elusive quality that I was talking about. It's perfection. It's simply perfect, and you can't say why. The ship was floating over the sea. You know, what is this word? Why? You weep as you say that.
И море, где бежали корабли. Это море.
But there's something so beautiful in Russian, but in English, no matter how you translate it, all you're saying is the ship was floating over the sea. And it doesn't do to you what sound and rhythm and intonation of the Russian does. This is what Nabokov decided to not even try to do. But of course there are people who hate it, like Edmund Wilson, who denounced him up and down. And they had a huge correspondence, which has now just produced a new book. You have the book?
I don't know. I didn't know about this.
Now there's a new monograph about the conflict that Nabokov,
I think it's called The Duel.
the duel.
The Duel.
Check it out. I also noticed that in the Pushkin is a collection of, I guess, novellas, short stories, unfinished pieces, and then at the end, what are called these kind of unfinished sketches, which is Pushkin kind of, some of them almost felt like exercises, like seeing how far he could kind of push. He's credited with, what, let me see if I can phrase this correctly, creating the Russian literary style. Why, what is that contribution?
Well, it's a peculiar, the case of the peculiar history of Russia, Russian language, Russian writing, because the church language was Church Slavonic, which was a form of Middle Bulgarian, which nobody ever really spoke. And then it sort of became an official language, which also nobody ever spoke. And the spoken Russian was sort of left to the peasants. What's his name? Who wrote the famous memoir? Avakum. Was that in spoken
Yeah,
Russian?
that's no. Yes, it was, but it is the 17th century. What
Right.
are you talking about?
Anyway, Russian artistic language finally only came together in the early 19th century. For us, English came together in the, well, I don't know, 12th century. So there's a long difference. So Russian arrived, I think one of the reasons for the greatness of 19th century Russian literature was that it's a real flourishing, it's a first flowering of Russian literature. It's as if it was their Elizabethan age. And everything they were doing was the first time it was done. And these doors were all open to them. But it's because of this history of the language. And then Pushkin somehow heard it. Pushkin actually grew up speaking French, like most aristocrats. He had to learn Russian, but he learned it very well. And that he heard how to do it. And his poetry, even when he was 15 years old, everybody was gasped when they heard it. how did you do that? Where did that come from? And that's the strange thing, it's an inexplicable thing. You can't say why is there are 40 Elizabethan playwrights, and then you read Shakespeare and you go, look at that. What is the difference? You know, but this is what he did to Russian, and he did it first with poetry, but then almost very consciously. And that's what you see in this book, how he worked with different kinds of novelistic technique, different kinds of forms, different ways of writing prose.
And in dialogue with the entire European literature around him, French and English. He knew it, he read it. He knew English, incidentally. He couldn't speak it because he didn't know how to pronounce, but he taught himself English.
He read Walter Scott.
And he actually, some people, some philologists think that English literature, he took more from English literature, more in dialogue with English
Than
literature than with French.
Well,
But anyway,
congratulations.
this is how he formed the language, and after him, all Russian writers have acknowledged that. Every generation they turn to Pushkin. They talk about Pushkin. The name of Pushkin is for them is a magical name. There is no writer quite like that in English or French, because we've been around much longer. Yes, there's a question.
What effect did Belinsky and Pushkin have? Pushkin obviously was a much more beautiful writer, but Belinsky was so inspirational. Was there a...
I mean, Belinsky, the critic.
Yes, because he wasn't much of a writer at all, but he was so passionately inspiring for so many of the further generations.
Yeah.
As you know, what was their... Did they ever, or did they, because Pushkin died so early at the age of 37, did they ever meet?
No, I don't think so. Did they meet?
No, Belinsky's next generation, they never met. They were belonged to very different social circles, and at that time
Belinsky
that was a serious
ideologist,
thing.
and there was no ideology in Pushkin.
His background was as a peasant, really.
Yeah, peasant and middle class.
Yeah.
But he was a revolutionary thinker. This was of great influence. But the beauty of, no, I shouldn't say it. The beauty of Pushkin is that there is none of that in him. It's pure literature. But that doesn't mean that it lives in some sort of dream world. It's extremely close to reality. But it doesn't have any theory behind it.
There is no ideology in Pushkin at all, ever. Only Belinsky, with his critical talent, could discern it in Pushkin and bequeath it to the all Soviet school children who had to learn it. For instance, in the Captain Daughter, the main topics really are there's the workings of the destiny of two young people, very young people, wonderful young people, and these workings of the destiny, the destiny works through such qualities as honor, gratitude, and mercy. And these qualities belong to all the characters in the story, except one, who is almost a theatrical villain. But there is no ideologically right people, like peasants, and ideologically wrong people,
There's no cause.
aristocrats. There's no cause. These qualities, they play out on all sides, through in everybody. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree, yeah. It's unbelievable.
And this mercy, just the hero of the story is gratitude and mercy. It's a beautiful story.
Even with Pugachev.
Yes, the bandit, the robber, all of a sudden
The
just
imposter.
Yeah, it's,
acquires some kind of robber's honor that
It's interesting that because Pushkin wrote both a history of Pugachev and the novel which deals with this, you don't know who Pugachev is, he was a rebel who claimed that he was the Tsar. And because there was a Tsar who was killed, he said, no, it's not, he wasn't killed, I am him. He actually got a big movement, 30,000, 40,000 men trying to take over. He wanted to get to Moscow or Petersburg, but they had to send the real army and stop him. But Pushkin wrote a history of him and shows him as a thorough, complete thug and murderer and dark spirit. But in the novel that grew out of that, The Captain's Daughter, Pugachev acquires a whole human side. And he's also capable of gratitude. In fact, his gratitude is what saves the whole novel.
yeah.
And then the hero goes to see him to be beheaded. And
don't
I'm sorry.
Spoiler, yeah.
But anyway, the sympathies. This is the most beautiful thing in Pushkin, that the sympathies move humanly among people in a very real, simple, authentic way. The beauty of it is that everything in Pushkin is ordinary. And I think only a great writer can do that. It's easy to...
because evil is more in literature. Evil is always more interesting.
It's true.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dostoevsky, whole career.
Yeah.
Well, take anybody. Evil in literature is interesting. It's very difficult to portray goodness and good people without being boring. And but
Without
Pushkin does
simply banality.
You had a question?
So I know you've said many times that you couldn't translate Evgeny Onegin, but it seems like if anyone could, it would be the two of you. And so, barring the rest of us learning Russian, is there any chance we could ever persuade you to translate it?
no.
On that note, what about other Russian poets? And if you're not going to translate them, else who would say translate Woznezensky or like Brodsky or Akhmatova. Like, I'll check a book out from the library, and it's just. There's a Richard Wilbur translation of 5 Woznezensky poems that are, in my opinion, phenomenal. But then I check out a book from the library, and it's just atrocious.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the current. If you're working on any translations of other Russian poets.
No, we avoid poets.
Noticeably, yeah.
Yeah, that's-
Because you are a poet yourself, right?
yeah. And it's, well, I was.
I somewhat beg to differ.
Yeah, I'd like to ask, I understand that Goethe's poetry is very difficult to translate into English. Is that true or not? Goethe.
Goethe? Yeah, I suppose it is.
I mean, I'm wondering what that is. Do you have any knowledge of it? Or
No, I haven't thought about it.
I understand it's very difficult, but,
Certainly he's been translated.
yeah, sure.
But Walter Kaufmann, of course, wrote beautifully about so many of the great Germans. Talks about the inherent Germanness of Goethe, which is kind of like what we're talking about, the inherent Englishness of Shakespeare, or the inherent Russianness of, say, Dostoevsky, that makes it difficult to translate into, other.
Yeah.
But Walter Kaufmann actually writes a couple of beautiful essays on difficulties in translating
I'd
Goethe.
also like to mention that I really appreciate your introductions, especially the one on Chekhov, in which he lists the various elements of literary program.
yeah.
And he ends with the statement, which I find extraordinary, is that he wants, above all, to demonstrate compassion
Compassion.
towards his characters. And
Yeah.
I think that sounds almost unique in authorship as a program. I mean, there have been other compassionate writers, but to make this, given such prominent status in his own mind.
Yeah. And especially with Chekhov, because you could see him as being very cynical. A lot of his stories are very sharp, very dark, and you don't notice this compassion that he felt in his plays as well.
Exactly.
We can do one more, just to make sure everybody gets their book signed. Yeah.
I have a comment and a question. I wanted to put a request that you translate Remezov, even though I know that he's widely disdained, but just putting it out there. My question is,
Remezov, yeah, it's very interesting.
yeah, Russians say that he's unreadable, so I'm just putting it out there. Is what I've read otherwise. My question is, I've read that there's that Yeskov uses Church Slavonic, so I wanted to know what that was like translating it about the relation between the Church Slavonic and the Russian that there was one.
Yeah, the question is about the presence of Church Slavonic in Russian language, especially in this book. He's a great writer. I wish more people would read it. But yes, Leskov plays with Slavonic because of his relation with the church and his interest in the church history and the church as a living force in Russia. But he uses it within Russian language. It's very difficult.
We have a rules or rule of thumb. If there is an indirect citation from the scripture or from the liturgical texts, we just use the existing.
We use King James.
We use King James or liturgical texts that, which have been all translated. Or if it is something just remotely reminiscent of Slavonic, we simply try to use archaic expressions.
So I know several of you grabbed copies of the Pushkin and some of the other books before we started. There are copies here as well. You're welcome to get the book and get it signed, and then you may pay on your way out the door. Give me just about 1 minute to flip the table. Please give a very big thank you to everyone.
I've read.
Oh, the jelly was so good.